Richard Blanco, what's a cocuyo?
Cocuyo, it's a firefly. I mean, technically it's a click beetle, but it's a kind of firefly that's it's very mythical in Cuba, and as well as even in South Florida where I grew up. And there's sort of a folk tale or sort of a folklore that the women used to pin the click beetles on their dresses and on their earlobes and in their hair as sort of a kind of a mating ritual, not a mating ritual, courting ritual, really. So that's part of the title, but it's also the name of my uncle's grocery store in the book, which is kind of where I grew up in a way, kind of where I came to really connect with my culture and my heritage by working in a Cuban grocery store in Miami. And so the book takes its title from that store, and also sort of the idea of Prince of the Cocuyos is the idea of a village, really that old adage of it takes a village. And it was growing up, the book centers a lot around growing up and being sort of ushered and connected to my heritage, my Cuban American heritage, through all the various people in the village, in my community. And so the store plays a central role in that through all the customers and all the regulars that I would form relationships with. So that's the gist of the title. So I'm elevated to Prince of their village, so to speak, or at least I feel like it.
Well, people watching this program will see the name and they'll know you best from January 21st,
Right.
2013. What happened on that day?
Well, I read a little poem at the inauguration to a few people, to about 850,000 people. I was President Obama's inaugural poet for the 2013 inauguration. So that was an amazing, amazing experience. And I've written about that in the book that came out in November. And this book now is sort of the behind the scenes of, it only goes to about age 16 and a half. But it's really sort of, I like to call it sort of the Richard Blanco unplugged, sort of. It's the behind the scenes of who is this little kid that would eventually grow up to be asked to be inaugural poet, to be bestowed by such an amazing honor. And so you start seeing, apart from the cultural element, you also start seeing sort of some of the influences as far as my inclination or my artistic impulses. I was a kid with a lot of coloring and a lot of playing with Play-Doh and a lot of crafts and all that, and then that in juxtaposition to my grandmother, who's also a big character in the story, who was very homophobic and xenophobic. So how she sort of shaped my life as well, and part of the reason I became an engineer was because of that homophobia and didn't pursue a career in the arts early on. So in this book, you sort of see, you're reading, I would hope you're reading with the context of this little kid who I'm showing you. It eventually grows up and reads this amazing moment in our history. So,
Why do you open the story with Abuela?
why do I open the story with Abuela? Well, Abuela, my grandmother, is a very significant character, as I said in the whole book. In some ways, she's a cause of a lot of trauma, and she was very verbally abusive, very homophobic, as I said, and xenophobic. But on the flip side of that, ironically, in some ways she made me a writer, because she made me sort of more withdrawn and made me an observer of the world versus a participant. Also, that led me to sort of learn how to read people. I had to know how to read people to know how to respond and not get called a you-know-what by her or by others. So all that power of observation and sort of reading in between the lines and all this sort of made me a writer in a way. It made me sit back and what do writers do after all except record and look at the world and try to see it from a different angle. So in part, she plays a big role in that sense. And also, again, the homophobia, so there's always this constant tension between us. Or, the idea that she was, on the one hand, a loving caretaker, which she was because she lived with us for 20-something years, and I was around her a lot. But at the same time, there was this other dark side. But it was really interesting to sort of explore that in the book, because I've done so in my poetry. But in the book, in the memoir, in the prose, my grandmother comes across as very differently. She comes across as actually this gregarious, wonderful, funny person, which she was on the surface. So yeah, and it's real because poetry sort of digs into more of digs right away into the sort of the internal character, Whereas in prose, in this book, I've had to sort of create the external character as well as the relationship. So, it was a loving relationship. I'm not complaining, so to speak, but she's very significant in that way.
The Cuban culture tends to be machismo culture, doesn't it?
Yeah, one of the things I'm really excited about this book, and one of the things that that was the first, ever since I wrote page one, is I was interested in seeing that intersection, how those things collide. So the idea of cultural sexuality, that I can't separate who I am growing up as a Cuban American kid from my sexuality, and also my artistic identity. So you have these triangulations of things. So yes, I studied engineering partly because of homophobia of my grandmother, but also it was a cultural circumstance. We were a working class immigrant family, and the idea of a career in the arts was just wasn't within the realm of possibility. So I'd love to see how all these three things sort of butt up against each other, collide, intersect, complement each other, to make this little kid called Ricky become who he is. And again, the idea of the village, but that, we can't separate those components of them in and of themselves. I have all these great labels that I love. First Latino, first immigrant, first gay man to read at the inauguration. Well, all those things sort of come together in one person. And part of the selfish reason for writing the book was to explore how those things connected, and what is that unique sort of recipe that makes a human being a human being. And that really excites me about the book, because I think it's something that's not sort of talked about often. And then, as you said, the machismo element, you have that combined with xenophobia. So my grandmother, another example of her being a main character, anything that was sort of culturally odd is also perceived as queer. So things like Fruit Loops or American foods were queer. Why are you eating that? Toys she couldn't understand. Anything in English was immediately suspect and thrown into the queer bin. So all those interesting layers of to make this crazy guy named Richard happen.
Richard Blanco, did you ever come out to your grandmother?
No, I did come out before she passed away, shortly before she passed away. And in the acknowledgments in this book, one of the reasons I think this book was also important with me, as I wrote in the acknowledgments, I learned to hate her, to understand her, to forgive her, to love her. And I think that happened finally with this book. But I did sort of have a moment of peace with her on her deathbed, so to speak. But at that age, she was already in her early 80s. And, again, it's also a generational thing. And so I didn't officially come out there. I had come out to my mother and the rest of the family. But she still insisted that I was going to be a confirmed bachelor, but I would have children. So, and would bribe me. She, at one point, offered me $10,000 to marry someone. So this was my grandmother. So you didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I wanted to take the money, but then when I said yes, sort of half fooling around, she said, "Okay, but first I'll give you $5,000 when you get married, then $2,000 for every time you have a kid." So she was, as I always said, my grandmother was the smartest and dumbest person I ever met in the world.
When did you first start? What was it about poetry that attracted you?
I've always had a left brain, right brain. I've always delved in both worlds since I was a little kid, and some of that is in the book as well. The sort of the engineer mind as well as the artistic mind. So, but again, the things that were encouraged, more so in an immigrant family, were more the traditional careers and the things that I would have a better life than they did, and doctor, lawyer, engineer. So I picked engineering and went about my business as an engineer, always thinking that someday I'd do something creative. And it wasn't until I was 24, and it was through working as an engineer that I realized how much writing there was involved. It was like writing reports, writing proposals, writing studies, all this, that I started falling in love with language. And from that, I just wrote a poem one day. I think I've thought poetically, and the book also has sort of, I try to infuse that poetic sensibility in passages. The challenge with a poet writing prose is that you have to remember to tell the story as well, and I think I learned that, and very well, hopefully. But I was always impressed by just images and sort of self-contained ways in which something can have meaning. And I remember my first poem was about watching watching a woman scurry down a staircase on her way to work late in red pumps, and I don't know why that's